All right, this is part 2 of our videos on China in period 3 of AP World History. Actually, some of these slides are going to talk about both the Tang and the Song dynasty together because culturally and socially and economically, even politically, there are a lot of similarities. So don't get confused by the title of this slide. This information actually applies to both dynasties. So one of the things we should be aware of is that there actually is a pretty strict hierarchy in place in China, and many of my students actually found this to be perplexing. So I want to sort of address this chart right off the bat. Many of them immediately looked at this and said, how on earth are merchants below peasants on the social ladder? All right, so the short answer to that question is that on the one hand, the merchant class is fairly small at this point, and the other is that peasants are essentially that they truly make up the bread basket rather of the entire country. Peasants are incredibly important just for the literal survival of a society. Another reason is that merchants, in terms of the way that they actually make a living, is not really something that is respected in the Confucian practice. Merchants essentially end up that what they are is they're traders, right? So they don't actually make anything, but rather they buy and sell things and make a profit off of it. So actually, in the Confucian order, the concept of a merchant was something that wasn't as respected as peasants. So if you are still confused about why that is, feel free to leave a comment below, but hopefully that makes more sense. Okay, so in general, back to this social order, the most important social class, they were the landed gentry, or we could also call them nobility. There were a lot of connections to medieval Europe here. All right, so gentry, if you think of the word gentleman, hopefully that will make you remember. The gentry are landed bureaucrats, right? Or not always bureaucrats, my apologies, but they are always landed members of the upper class, right? So they have to own property. Some of them actually end up studying for and passing the civil service exam, and from there they can enter into jobs in the bureaucracy. So, one other thing that I found interesting here is if we think about what the civil service exam requires, we know that you have to study for a very long period of time, so therefore you most likely need the leisure time to prepare for such an exam. Now, the gentry class, they are very wealthy, but in practice they don't do much work. Their wealth comes from their property. They employ peasants to do all the hard labor. So that frees up a lot of leisure time for the gentry to do things like study for the civil service exam. So even though in theory the civil service exam was a meritocracy, it's actually very difficult for someone who isn't already wealthy to study for and pass this exam. As far as peasants are concerned, they are the largest part of the population. In this period, in the Tang and Song dynasty, peasants make up about 90% of the population. So again, very, very significant here. In terms of the merchants, going back to them briefly, albeit a small class, merchants did have the opportunity to become very wealthy if their business was successful. So just because the merchants are low on the social ladder in the Tang and Song dynasty does not mean they will stay that way. So we'll see how this changes as time goes on. And of course, some merchants have the ability, with their wealth, to buy land, which would actually mean that they would go into the gentry class. Also, if they have enough money, they might be able to also take the civil service exam and become a bureaucrat. In terms of the Song dynasty, we first need to, just geography, we need to realize that in terms of size, it is definitely smaller than the Tang dynasty, which we hopefully remember from the last video, goes very far west. The dynasty, just in terms of population, in the northern region, you actually have many invasions coming from nomads that hail from the region of Manchuria, which is up here. So many nomads from Manchuria end up invading the northern part of the Song dynasty, and eventually the Manchurians actually established their own dynasty to the north that's called the Jin Dynasty, Jin. The Song dynasty, just like the Tang, is very prosperous and it has very very a flourishing element of culture and art and architecture and education. The bureaucracy, if anything, gets stronger as time goes on. Get rid of that here. So this is really a continuation of the civil service exam, the significance of that we saw in the Tang Dynasty. It actually adds more positions in government over time. The Emperor Song Taizu ends up making special efforts to expand the education system. And what that does is it allows men from lower social classes to hopefully attain government jobs. So he really tries to make it more of a meritocracy. It was still very difficult for poor people to work in the bureaucracy, again, because they have essentially more work to do. But the Song Dynasty represents one of the strongest examples of meritocracy in Chinese dynastic history. The problem with expanding the bureaucracy, though, is that eventually it got too big. And so this actually over time contributes to the weakness of the government, right? If you have a very large territory to govern and manage, a lot of times it is ultimately it's going to be difficult to do that. You might experience internal rebellions and the like. And actually, as the dynasty continues, we're going to see that there are also outside trouble that we're going to use this slide for, but I want to go ahead and then come back to this. So let's talk a little bit more about the gentry class, or the bureaucrats. There were two ways in which one could really become a member of the gentry. One was that, of course, you were born into it, right? That your family has wealth, normally because they own a lot of property. Wealth and property ownership go hand in hand. In fact, having things like gold and silver don't mean much, because gold and silver at the end of the day is just a metal, right? If you actually own property, the idea is that you will probably profit off of that, and it will gain value over time. And the other way that you could become a member of the gentry was by holding an advanced degree, right? By going to a university and ideally passing the civil service exam. And of course, many bureaucracies actually had both of these qualifications. They were both they were both wealthy, and they passed the civil service exam. Okay, this is gross, so I'll only stick here for a second. But one thing that's interesting is that just in terms of the way in which class members dress, wear their hair, and in this case, their nails, actually indicates their social status. And so if you're a member of the scholar gentry, you actually don't cut your fingernails. This was essentially an indicator that you did not have to work with your hands, right? That was seen as more peasant work. So by growing incredibly long nails, that showed that you were of a high social caste. And somehow, don't ask me how, but somehow these scholars, even though they had crazy long nails, were still able to write, they were still able to create art. And this is a photograph, which is crazy, because this is not even during the Song Dynasty, this is way later. This is a doctor, so presumably he was able to perform surgery with nails like this. In any case, let's talk about women a little bit. Okay, so foot binding. It's obviously very difficult for us to, you know what? Actually, hold up. I told you I was going to go back to that last slide, and I fulfill my promises. So let's just briefly talk about what happens to the Song Dynasty as time goes on. So the Song Dynasty actually, you can tell that it is experiencing some threats from the outside because they moved their capital twice during the dynasty. At first, the capital was in Chang'an, which is around here, centralized China, but they start to experience increased invasions from the Mongols that are coming from the north. And so first, the Song leaders move the capital to here, Kaifeng, which is about 530 miles east of Chang'an. Chang'an, by the way, is modern-day Xi'an, which is spelled Xian. And then the Song Dynasty again moves the capital. This time they move it to Huangzhou, which is about 400 miles further south from Kaifeng. So we can infer from that that there are invasions coming in from the north that are challenging the Song Dynasty. Eventually, because of these northern threats, the dynasty actually divides in half. You have the southern and northern Song Dynasty. The northern Song ends up succumbing to outsiders, But the southern Song continues and it survives until 1279 CE, when that too is going to fall to the Mongols. All right, and then the nomadic Mongol Empire gets rid of the Song dynasty completely, and it establishes the Yuan dynasty, which we're going to talk about pretty soon. Before the Song dynasty even falls, they already are paying tribute to the Mongols. So we can see that the tables have turned slightly here. We remember that earlier, especially during the Tang dynasty, the other outside countries like Korea and Vietnam are paying tribute to China. Now it's the other way around. China actually is going to have to pay outsiders because their military is weak. So eventually the Song dynasty does fall completely to the Mongols. And that will obviously be something that we'll pick back up on. All right, so let's talk about the treatment of women a little bit. One of the things that is difficult, obviously, for us to take in is that this is something that is incredibly painful, that it is something, it's no longer practiced today, at least not legally, but this was a way to essentially revoke women into an inferior status. Interestingly, actually, the practice of foot binding was advocated by the only female empress in Chinese history, Wu Zetian. So despite the fact that she was a woman, she was not a feminist. She actually thought that women should continue the practice of foot binding. And so here's what happens. When Chinese women are still growing, when they are still girls, they wrap the foot to constrict it. This actually, over time, ends up breaking a number of bones in their foot, and the result is a much smaller foot. The toes are actually broken in the process, and after that, you see that essentially women are able to fit into these very, very small shoes called Lotus Shoes. And the goal is for women to have these very, very tiny feet. This was seen as a status of beauty at the time, but the problem is that the physical damage that occurs to a woman's foot during this practice makes her very vulnerable, and it also makes it so that it's very difficult for her to walk normally. So essentially, it renders many women helpless. They essentially become ornaments to their husbands or ornaments to men in their society. Foot binding continued to be a legal practice until the fall of the last Chinese dynasty, which was the Qing dynasty, and that doesn't end until 1911. And I know it's written down, but just as a warning, so feel free to look away, there are going to be a couple of graphic images in the next slide showing us some more images of foot binding. Okay, so this, I know, hard to look at, but I really want you guys, if you are still watching, to get the sense of how damaging this was to a woman's foot. And here's more of an X-ray image of what foot binding looked like. This is another image of an elderly woman with bound feet. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about culture here, and I, again, want us to just consider a couple of main ideas and also, ideally, consider what we've learned so far. So first off, it's important, again, for us to process the idea that the Tang and Song dynasties represented a golden age of stability, political centralization, and a flourishing economy. For the reflect question, this actually wasn't written initially for the AP class, so hopefully it's easy to answer this one. The answer to this question is Confucianism, right? That's how the government, both in the Tang and the Song dynasty, is shaped around. All right, so as far as the achievements are concerned during the Tang dynasty, first, it's really important for us to realize that the trade networks are extensive. They trade as far east as Persia and India, and they trade as far west as Japan. Because they are now trading with Japan, we know that their seafaring industry, or their navy, is expanding and growing, becoming more, essentially becoming more powerful. This also means that the Chinese are going to start culturally influencing the areas that they trade with. Oh, this is a Chinese ship called the Junk, and we can see here that it ultimately, I mean, it's certainly something that can handle a pretty extensive amount of cargo. So this is actually one of the new technological achievements of the Tang and Song dynasty. Other achievements in terms of agriculture, there is going to be a massive increase in agricultural yield. Uh, a new type of rice is developed that matures at an early. It matures with less time, so that means that the farmers can have up to from 2 to 3 rice harvests every single year. This, of course, if there's a greater agricultural yield, means that there's going to be more food, which ultimately means that the population is going to skyrocket in China. And lastly, you actually see that one of the emperors in the Tang Dynasty develops some land reform that is intended to help establish some more equality in the agricultural sector. So, this was called the this was called the equal field system. This was developed by the Emperor Wang Ming, and what he does, or not Wang Ming, that was during the Han Dynasty. My apologies. So anyway, during the Tang Dynasty, the equal field system, what it did was first the goal was to ensure that all Chinese families had a parcel of land to cultivate. So essentially, it gave up little bits of land to each farmer. We may think that this is sort of a humanitarian goal, right? The idea is to sort of establish equality, but actually that's not really what the emperor was going for when he established the equal field system. What he was trying to do is he was trying to actually take land away from the aristocrats, because the aristocrats actually were the greatest threat to the emperor's power. Okay, so just want to look at some statistics here. We get, just for comparison's sake, right? I think that a lot of this stuff is really fascinating. First off, we see that the population in the Han and Tang Dynasty are essentially the same. In terms of the size, we see that both of these earlier dynasties are mainly concentrated in the north of China. Then when we get to the Song Dynasty, we see a number of changing trends. First of all, the population of China doubles during the Song Dynasty. Secondly, the population moves. More and more people, definitely the majority of the Chinese population during the Song Dynasty, is living in the southern part of the country. And if you remember from one of the earlier slides, which I'm going back to right now, that the capital does ultimately end up moving over time, right? So when the capital is in Hangzhou, it makes sense actually for the population to move along with it. Stay with me, I'm not finished. I just wanted to spare you from those foot binding pictures yet again. So I mentioned this earlier, but it's also important for us to acknowledge that with such a stable government and a thriving economy, this is a very good and prosperous period in terms of culture for China. And this is both the Tang and the Song dynasties. We're going to see a flourishing of poetry, of art, porcelain making, music, and architecture, all during these dynasties. We also see many technological innovations over time. One of the most important ones, I would argue, would be in terms of printing. The Chinese already had invented paper in an earlier period, but now they're starting to advance the ways in which they actually write things and exchange things. So they actually start to invent movable type and block printing during the Tang and Song dynasty. If you're familiar with European history, you could compare this to to Johann Gutenberg's printing press, which might actually give you pause, because if you know your European history, you might know that the printing press was not invented by Gutenberg until the 1400s. But here we are, about 200 years before that, seeing that there was a printing press in China. So just like the compass, we could step back and ask the question, all right, who invented it first, right? Was it in Europe or in China? Again, speaking of compass, that's another thing that the Chinese start to use pretty frequently during the Tang and Song dynasties. Hopefully this is not a surprise to us, since they are trading by sea more. For example, their trade with Japan. The Chinese also use gunpowder very readily, and this is going to be a major, major factor in the evolution of warfare, not just in China, but abroad. Over time, the Chinese are going to trade the gunpowder that they developed with other parts of the world, and this, of course, will have notable consequences in warfare. They use their knowledge of paper to create currency, and also this image up here shows us porcelain, which was very valuable and highly desired in foreign markets. All right, in terms of art, we do see an usual trend in Chinese art throughout the generations, actually. This is not exclusive just to the Tang and Song dynasty, of landscape paintings. There are a number of different significances behind them. There are some connections to Buddhism as well as Confucianism. And some art actually represents the changing seasons as well. Some of that, of course, leads back to the more old attachment to agriculture, to the land, right, to the significance of a yield, maybe looking forward to the future season and the harvest that will come. We also see that in terms of writing, calligraphy is going to become increasingly popular, and calligraphy creates a growing profession for skilled calligraphers, right? To be able to actually write in this style is not something that anyone could do. And of course, the use of this writing in the art, the stuff that is preserved, gives us a greater understanding of what society was like during the Tang and Song dynasty. In terms of architecture, rather, one of the most notable or signature structures that we will see in China during the Tang and Song dynasties is the pagoda, which actually tends to be a religious structure, mostly associated with Buddhism. So if you ever go to China, you may come across many of these, but of course not limited to China. There are many other Buddhist countries that sport pagodas. The Japanese have lots of them. They tend to actually be taller in height. And the Vietnamese have lots of them. The Koreans do. In Thailand, there are many pagodas. But I just mention that because, of course, when Buddhism starts to spread into China even more during the Tang dynasty, so do the structures. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is also hopefully a handy chart for you that gives you a sense of all the different things that are created in China during the Tang and Song dynasties. Of course, I wouldn't expect you to memorize this stuff for the AP exam, but it does certainly give you a sense of how important technology was to this time period, and it will give you further evidence as to why China experienced a golden age during the Tang and Song dynasty. All right, so let's close off by just asking a couple of questions. First off, in terms of farming techniques, we could ask, all right, is there an improvement in that way? Let's go back. I don't think I talked about this in as much detail as I should have. I did mention the equal field system, but if we go back to the farming slide, blast that animation. Another thing that we might notice here is the terraced farming. This is not new to us. We probably remember that terraced farming existed in the Americas in actually period 2 and period 1, right? So this is by no means novel, but it was something that helped improve agricultural yields. We also see that, of course, rice cultivation will be improved because it's going to be built directly into flooded fields, right? So these new farming methods, as we discussed in that previous slide, are going to be one of the major reasons why the population doubles during the Song dynasty. All right, and last, this could be something that you could certainly do on your own, and I would say let's do more than 2 because you guys are smarter than that, but certainly if you were asked a question on the AP exam or one of my tests in class about technology during the Tang and Song dynasties, go back to this chart and think on your own about why these things are so significant for history as a whole. All right, that will wrap it up for China. We'll pick back up next time with some talk about Korea and Japan.